Okay, we're live.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. The meeting of the Tax Review Commission is called to order. The first item on our agenda is public testimony. Is there any public testimony today?
We have not received any.
Okay, thank you very much. Then moving on to the minutes of the October 20th meeting. Were there any additional edits suggested? If not, may I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thank you, Murray. Second? Winston?
Second.
Was that, sorry, who was the second?
Sorry, second.
Okay, thank you, Winston. So all in favor, let's see, I'm going to call on you by name as I see you on my screen. Kate?
Yes.
Alton?
Yes.
Scott?
Yes.
Sale?
Yes.
Murray?
Yes.
Winston?
Yes.
And chair votes yes too. So minutes are approved. Now on to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaufman, for joining us again today and bringing your team. And we're really looking forward to hearing your study today. So take the floor.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to give you an update. So I think mainly for the public, this is in an update in regards to the carbon tax analysis that myself and our research team will introduce in just a second, did for the State Energy Office that was released last April. And this, the request from the Tax Review Commission was to do additional analysis around ways to use the revenue, as well as digging more into the administrative considerations more broadly. So with me today in this work is Maya Shervine, who is on as a panelist, as well as Paul Bernstein. And the fourth member of our research team who isn't here as a panelist today, but might be listening in, is Sumner LaCroix. So, oh, there he is. He's a panelist. Hi, Sumner. Oh, and your name says Maya, but that's okay. We know you're Sumner LaCroix.
Actually, just to jump in, since we're recording this. Oh, sorry. Do you mind, Sumner, do you mind changing your name with Zoom just because it like clarifies things?
I'll do it right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No problem.
Great. Sumner is traveling, so he might have slightly patchy internet, but I'm glad to see he's joined. So let me just get my screen shared up. And let's see. Okay, so diving right into it, again, reiterate the scope of work. It's to do some additional scenario analysis pertaining to how to use the revenues. And the request from the TRC and the scope of work that we developed together was really around exploring further ways to slice the use of revenues towards the household dividend, potentially making it more progressive, meaning proportionally benefiting lower income households by weighting the dividend towards the lower income quintiles, as well as getting more insights into potentially splitting revenues between government spending and household revenues. And I think for members of the audience, I'm kind of just jumping straight into this, but for members who might be watching this later on now, if you want to dig into the original scenarios, as well as the assumptions behind the model report, the carbon pricing study is publicly available on the Hawaii State Energy Office website. So I encourage you to look there. But for time considerations, I'm just gonna jump right into this work. And then second, administrative considerations, things that we've been digging into are ways to levy and collect the carbon price. And here I'm using the word sort of price more broadly, because this could be through a tax or through a cap and trade system. And we've been exploring ways that a cap and trade system could function, because the prior study really focused on the tax elements, as well as the use and distribution of the new revenue source. Most of the emphasis on the distribution aspects. So as a quick reminder, the tax rate that we're looking at here is the is the federal social cost of carbon. And this was actually kind of reaffirmed and updated recently by the Biden administration as the sort of official federal cost of carbon. It had previously been used by the Obama administration. And you can see it's sort of escalating levels. And we're assuming that it goes into effect in the year 2025. And our model time horizon looks at a 20-year time period and solves in 5-year increments. So the difference here between this and the prior report is that the prior report had this tax level scenario as well as a much higher price pathway. Here we're really focusing on the social cost of carbon price pathway. And we have 7 additional scenarios that we're looking at. So we had no great way to label these because there's a lot of scenarios. So we decided to keep it simple. It's just S1 through S9, and let me talk you all through it. The 2 first scenarios are shown in the prior report. And this is really so that we all have a sort of baseline of comparison. And we'll be bringing these results in so that we can see that change, right? And these were the 2 bookend assumptions we made around the use of the revenues in the prior analysis. This was that households get all of the non-aviation carbon tax revenues in equal payments, and Q1 through Q5 stands for the household income quintiles that we were able to estimate based on Bureau of Labor Statistics consumer expenditure survey. So in this first scenario, households receive all of the revenue payments that they're able to, and this is all of the non-aviation carbon tax revenues. And none of it stays with the state government. On the second scenario, it's the opposite, right? So that it all goes towards existing government spending patterns, and households receive no dividend payment. So these were the bookends that we started with in the prior study. And we're adding on S3 to S9, which look at many variations of the bookends, right? And we had to, when Murray, you and I were talking about this, it was, we had to bound this somehow, right? Obviously the number of scenarios could sort of be endless. So what we did was we looked at the first, so S3 and S4 are around not taxing aviation fuels. And the reason for this scenario, as was brought up in the last meeting that I was invited to discuss that, is it's not entirely clear how that would work per a number of federal laws, particularly the Anti-Head Tax Act and interstate commerce laws. So it's possible it could, but that definitely additional legal analysis, like kind of legal taxation analysis is useful here. And Seth, it would be interesting to know whether DOTAX has any thoughts on this, but from an economic and greenhouse gas standpoint, we run these scenarios in order to understand how the impacts change when you don't levy the tax on aviation related greenhouse gas emissions. And we keep the use of revenues the same as the ones above. So we have 2 bookend scenarios around the use of revenues when aviation fuels go untaxed. Scenarios 5 through 9 are variations of going back to taxing all fossil fuels in the state of Hawaii, except for military fossil fuels. So about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions are taxed in the case that it's levied on aviation fuels. And then different ways to slice and dice the use of the revenue. So in S5, we're looking at households getting all of the non-aviation revenues. However, equal payments are made to household income groups quintiles 1 through 4. So this is the first 80% of household income groups, right? Excluding the highest 20% in terms of household income. The reason we chose to make the cutoff between Q4 and Q5, and Murray and I had some back and forth on this in the scope of work, is this is where we see a really big jump in terms of average household incomes in these quintiles, right? So Q4 and Q3 are much more similar to one another than Q4 and Q5. So it seemed like a natural break point.
McKenna, excuse me. Can you just give us an idea what the parameters are for each of these quintiles?
Let's see. I should have don't know if I have a slide at the end that has that in there, but basically, you're looking at buckets of the lowest household income, or the lowest household quintile, right? The first 20% of household income to the top 20% is the way that's broken out. In terms of, so you'd have to match that to the census data to sort of understand how households fit in there now. And I don't have that off the top of my head. Sorry, Beth.
Okay.
But I
Thank you.
actually think at the very end, I have a slide that might have it in there. So let's loop back around to that.
Okay, thank you.
I do, but this was the logic of the break of why we broke at Q4, was that there's a much larger jump between Q4 and Q5 than from Q4 to Q3. Okay, so S6 through S9 are variations thereof. So in S6, it is equal shares are given to the first 4 quintiles, not to quintile 5. So it's also kind of progressive by design. But in this case, 20% of the revenues are left to government spending. In S7, it's equal shares given to all households, but 20% to government spending. In S8, it's 50-50. So 50% are given to the first 4 quintiles and 50% to government spending. And S9, also 50-50, except back to the equal shares to households 1 through 5. So sorry, it's a lot of scenarios that we're looking at. So I apologize. We discovered no real easy way to label them. And so we just have it where you can kind of see this nomenclature. So there's taxed, all but aviation, share to households, and then which households receive it. So hopefully that sort of keeps the scenarios straight. This graph you see here is the change in greenhouse gas emissions in the scenarios in comparison to our estimated baseline, which we document in our initial report in detail, where there is no carbon tax, right? So here you can see these are the first, this S1 and S2 we have in our original report. This is the case where you're taxing all sectors, all fossil fuel sectors. Sorry, was there a question? And you can see you have approximately 7% additional greenhouse gas emissions abated relative to the baseline, whereas in 2045, it's about an additional 13%. So the major difference here is whether aviation fuels are taxed or not, right? So all of S1, S2, and then S5 to 9, these are all really similar. Really similar. Right? The major difference is the jump up here. In this case, these are the scenarios where aviation fuels aren't taxed. And so you see a much more muted reduction in greenhouse gas emissions abatement. So any sort of changes in economic outcomes need to be kind of contextualized into that. So here, similarly, so this is the major indicator of changes in the overall economy, total output. And here you can see relative to the scenarios we had in the original report, in the case that aviation fuels are not taxed, the economy fares better, right? And this, and particularly when aviation is not taxed and households receive a dividend payment. In the case that aviation fuels are not taxed and households don't receive a dividend payment, it sort of sits a little bit more in line with these other scenarios, which really kind of split the difference, right? Of our similar finding that the economy is better, relatively speaking, when households receive the dividend payment, because there is a rebound effect. There's a little bit of recovery, ameliorating what is, otherwise a contractionary effect when households receive that payment. So looking at household consumption, this is sort of this is a measure of household welfare. You can see that when households receive the payment.
Sorry, McKenna, can I ask a question before you get too much further?
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm sorry. On that previous slide with the change in output.
Yeah.
Is that a total, so like half a percentage point, is that a total reduction or is that an annualized reduction?
That is, so it's not a year-on-year reduction. It's a total reduction from the baseline.
Okay, so it's much smaller than if it was 0.5% a year. So you're not saying economic growth, if it was 3% a year, would only be 2.5% a year. You're saying by the time you get to 2025, 2030, it's that 0.5% off the total, not annualized. It's not compounding.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not compounding, so it's much smaller than the way you would think of a year-to-year change.
Yeah,
Yes.
very modest. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, and Marie, to drive that point home, this is against what is likely an assumption of a growing gross state product baseline, right? So from that perspective, it's not negative relative to today, right? It's negative relative to the baseline.
Got it.
Okay, so going into household consumption, you can see that whether the revenues are returned to households is the most important thing in terms of the welfare impacts to households. And that when revenues are returned to households, the policy is overall progressive, right? And progressive means that lower income households proportionately benefit from the introduction of the carbon tax and dividend mechanism. So here is kind of the core scenarios we had in the prior report where we see that very clearly. So this is progressive, whereas when the dividends aren't given back, it is regressive. We find that this still holds in the case where aviation is not taxed. You can see a slight difference in quintile 5. So the highest income quintile is relatively better off in the case that aviation is not taxed. And the reason is they're the largest consumers of aviation, right? So there is small changes, small differences there. Very, very similar results in the case that in terms of household welfare, in the case that there are no dividends and no aviation taxed. Here we have some interesting results when we start to weight the dividend payments to certain households, as well as when we start to split it between government spending and households. So, and basically what you see is the more that government spending takes as a percentage, so going from S5 to S9, the lower the benefits to households, right? Which makes entire sense if we're comparing direct payments. So if you were to weight payments to the lower 4 quintiles, they would clearly be made better off. And this is the case of which the lowest income quintile is made better off because payments are now split amongst fewer people, right? Fewer households. And so these payments are larger. And we see losses for the highest income household, but it's not huge. And then we sort of see this step down here. The highest income household, you really can't see that. It's basically at the 0 mark. And this is the case where the government keeps 20% and Q1, Q5 receive equal share payments of the rest. And sort of similar here, except now we see the top income quintile flip to the negative when there's an equal split, just because the payments are lower. Are there questions on this? This is sort of completing the modeling side of things. So let's maybe dwell here for a little bit and see if there are any questions.
All right, I have a quick question. Just as a fellow model user, did any counterintuitive results come out of your remodeling? Or was this kind of everything that did the model behave as you guys expected?
It did. The model behaved as we expected, right? Particularly around, so when you're not imposing the tax on aviation fuels, then you lower the sort of total coverage of the carbon tax relative to total greenhouse gas emissions from about 80% to 60%. So that it's kind of intuitive then that you would reduce greenhouse gas emissions less, as well as have kind of a lower contraction of the economy. But it's interesting though, because visitors, the interesting part of this that is maybe not totally intuitive, but did behave as we expected after sort of digging into the prior study, was that because visitor spending is a relatively substantial portion, about a third of payments into the carbon tax revenue, even though the case where you don't levy aviation related taxes, household welfare, you would expect, because you're not contracting the economy as much, that household welfare would be relatively improved, but it's actually not particularly, because that's actually the number one way visitors are paying into the carbon tax revenue. So instead, we find kind of very similar results.
And then I have one more question. So in terms of reducing carbon emissions, since you guys work with this, I don't know what's a lot. So like if we decreased carbon tax emissions by say 10% before, what does that compare to, like changing fuel efficiency standards or something, other types of regulation, right? So like, because one of the things we're really trying to do is we're trying to decide how best to move the state to decarbonize, right? And so is it much more effective just to tell HECO, hey, you're forced to turn off the carbon or the coal gas plant? Is that more than 10%? I was just wondering if you could give us some kind of like relative impact for these numbers so we can have a visceral sense of things.
Yeah, no, so that's a super good question. And so it's complicated in the sense that our baseline includes the RPS, right? So that's why I've been kind of careful with my words to say that adding the carbon tax reduces emissions an additional 10%. However, without the RPS there in the baseline, it would actually be a much larger price signal, right? Because these two policies interact. So what we find here with the RPS in the baseline is that it reduces emissions an additional 10%. It does actually reduce emissions additionally in the electric sector as well, even though the RPS remains the binding policy from the perspective of electricity generation, right? Which is the way we've operationalized the RPS constraint in our model. It's a renewable sources of electricity generation target, right? So that remains binding because under this level of carbon taxation, of course, if you upped the carbon tax, that would cease to be true. But that remains binding, but you still get additional emissions reductions, because the thing the RPS doesn't do is it doesn't really incent changes to behaviors in the way you run existing fossil fuel units from a greenhouse gas standpoint. And so the carbon tax would have the price signal on the fossil fuel portion of electricity generation, where the RPS does not. This is not part of the analyses we did for the prior report or here, but if you took the RPS out of it, and well, if you kind of just think about it in terms of like the relative cost differentials, basically the carbon, and Paul, please correct me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, but when you layer the carbon tax on the RPS, it effectively kind of lowers the cost of the RPS because you're taking that cost into the carbon tax, right? And it lowers it by a pretty substantial amount. Paul, I think it's about 60% in the way that those policies interact.
Correct. I guess the other way could look at it is that if the carbon tax were raised to a bit over $100 a ton by 2045, it would essentially render the RPS standard as non-binding or irrelevant or what have you. The carbon tax would be bringing about all the reductions that the RPS standard achieves.
I have a very basic question.
I hope that answers.
I'm thinking that I'm maybe not understanding what you're talking about here. When you were talking about each of these lines for the quintiles, I was thinking you were talking about the economic effects of this tax on the household, but that doesn't seem to match my understanding of the title of this slide. So where have I gone wrong? I have a very basic question. And this is not part of the analyses we did for the prior report or here, but if you were talking about each of these lines for the quintiles, I was thinking you were talking about the economic effects of this tax on the household, but that doesn't seem to match my understanding of the title of this slide. So where have I gone wrong?
I'm sorry, my internet cut out and I cut out there for a moment. Beth, can you repeat your question? I apologize.
Certainly, certainly. And by the way, we lost your presentation on the screen. So as you were going through each of those scenarios and pointing out the differences in the households, I was assuming that you were talking about the economic impact on the household, but that didn't seem to match my understanding of the title of that slide. So what do you mean by the consumption? I thought that was the consumption of fossil fuels. So I'm thinking maybe I'm not quite getting this.
No, I think of it as the economic impact to the households, right? Their economic welfare. So this isn't their consumption of fossil fuels, it's their total kind of buying power.
Okay, yeah, I guess I don't necessarily look at it in the same terms, so I will try to look at it from that point of view. Thank you for
Well,
that.
that's a good reminder. We can relabel this to make it more clear in the report.
Yeah, I think some of your discussion about consumption may be just a little bit ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So this is we'll make that a lot more clear in the report. This is a metric, a welfare metric, calculated based on it's an economic welfare metric calculated an equivalent variation, which is extremely wonky. So we were trying to find a less wonky way to say it, but maybe it got a little too vague. So the calculation is, how does your kind of, consumption bundle change as it moves into these kind of new prices relative to your buying power?
Thank you.
Chairman, can I just jump in and answer Elizabeth's question about the household income? I pulled it up here. So the bottom quintile's average household income is about 18,000, whereas the second is 51,000, middle is 83,000, the fourth 125, and then the top quintile is about 250,000.
And those are in 2012 dollars.
Sorry, that was actually 2020, which is why I took a little time to dig it out.
Oh,
So
you inflated it. Okay, great.
yeah, that's
Thank
2020.
you. Really appreciate that.
McKenna, I'm curious on the aviation piece of this. I'm mostly focused because, just because of the things we've talked about on kind of scenarios, probably kind of 6 through 9, the 80-20, the 50-50, and those scenario breakdowns, since it's my personal assumption that unless the state gets to keep some of that money to, help them out with state spending, that a carbon tax is probably dead on arrival if the state doesn't see anything in it for them, if you will, in terms of the state budget. But on each of those scenarios, you assume that the aviation fuel is taxable, which I sincerely hope to be the case, but it sounded really iffy. And I'm wondering, I know you're not a lawyer and this is not your expertise, but based on what you've heard to date, if you had to guess today, and I'm asking you to go beyond your specific expertise, I guess, but if you had to guess today, do you think that the aviation piece of that is doable? If you had to place a bet, do you think that's doable or not? Because if you think it's not doable, we probably need to see, 6 through 9 as also with no aviation. I know it's just explodes the number of scenarios, but I'm just worried about that. I hope it's taxable.
Yeah, well, this is where I might request Seth jump in from DOTAX's perspective. I'm not a tax lawyer, so I don't feel super confident in my answer. I did read the Anti-Head Tax Act really carefully and look at the way that the existing aviation fuel tax is treated in the state, right? Where there is a very small tax on aviation fuels. I think it's, something like a cent. And it goes specifically per federal statute to the use, to maintaining aviation related activities, for example, the airport, right? And so that is how we sort of carved out that assumption. The question of whether a state would have the ability to truly levy a effectively higher tax on aviation fuels, I think depends on a few things, right? So if it was done totally upstream via the barrel, my guess is that that is a different thing than taxing finished product from a sort of interstate issues and aviation issues perspective. Whether it would, change, how it would change that market and maybe push it from refining on island to importing finished product is, not quite in the scope here. But those are the things, I think, some of the considerations. And then there's just the kind of I think, question of like, we don't have a lot of places to look for this. California is not taxing aviation fuels directly within their cap and trade program. So I don't know, that didn't really totally answer your question,
No,
Marie.
I think it makes sense because maybe Seth can answer. Seth, I believe that most of the aviation fuel in the state, and I could be wrong about this, I believe most of it is not imported as refined product. I believe it's imported as oil and it's refined locally. And if that's the case, and if the barrel tax is taxed at the incoming raw, crude, I should say, crude barrel, then in effect, the barrel tax affects aviation fuel. Therefore, a carbon tax levied at the barrel and not at the refined product could, in theory, affect it. Does that not follow, or am I missing something?
When I had done research on this in the past, you can tax it, but it has to stay within the, it's basically a foreign trade zone, right? So it has to, all the money has to stay there. So it goes back to the airport, and eventually, like, my assumption is it just reduces their gate fees, right? So like the airlines are paying for the use of that airport, right? We take a tax and we say, oh, okay, you're going to get taxed for that. And then the airport says we don't need to get taxed as much in other areas. So that's how I operate with the assumption. I also operate with the assumption that the fuel tax, and I'm not a lawyer, but I often operate with the assumption that the fuel tax is not, or aviation fuel is not going to be taxed in a way that would really disincentivize extreme use, which is the point of the carbon tax.
Yeah, I guess I understand. Last thing I'll say, because I don't want to take McKenna's presentation off track, but if the barrel tax is taxing every barrel of crude that comes in the state, and if the aviation fuel is refined in state, not imported as refined, then in effect, the barrel tax does affect aviation fuel. It's just not a tax on refined aviation fuel. And if that's true, then a carbon tax, in theory, also applied at the barrel of crude level, could indirectly affect aviation fuel as well. So I think that's the thing we probably need to explore. I'll take that on myself and kind of look into that and find out if that's the case.
And the other thing you have to think about is like the proceeds from barrel taxes that go to aviation fuel, is my understanding, needs to stay within the airport. Right. So that's another issue in terms of redistribution, and you can't give it back to, my understanding is that you can't get it back to the, you can't do it in terms of a tax credit, you're right. So it can't be a redistributive issue. That's my thing. We got Jonathan White on the call, who's a real lawyer, who is a lawyer, and he may be able to do some research into that as the consultant, if you guys want. I don't know, we can ask him. He's on the call.
Yeah, I can do some research on the barrel tax and the allocation of the barrel tax, and just to make sure that we're free to allocate the barrel tax revenues, or that the state's free to allocate the barrel tax revenues freely. I've never done this particular research, but I think that they play around with the barrel tax allocations all the time. So I don't think there's a lot of restrictions on that. So I think my gut is that Murray's correct in that the barrel tax is a little freer than like a direct tax on aviation fuel per se.
It's indirect, but still economically effective. Yeah.
So I'll do some research on that, and I can report back at the next meeting, I guess. And that might be too late. So or we can set whatever up. But I'll look into that.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. And I'm wondering if you can get it done. We're not meeting again until November 17th. Whatever you can find, if you could share that with Dr. Kaufman and her team, that might be helpful as well.
Okay, well, when I get something together, I'll go to Seth and we'll take care of that.
Excellent. Thank you.
And Jonathan, just make sure when you're looking into it, my understanding is a lot of that is in the free trade zone. So you have to couple that free trade zone barrel stuff with the other parts of the barrel tax.
Okay, thanks.
I just want to reiterate also, in case it was unclear, that in the welfare impacts that McKenna just showed, the revenues from aviation fuel does not go back to households.
Yeah, so what we've modeled is very consistent with what you said, Seth, right? That our assumptions, so our understanding of it is very similar to what you said, or the same as what you said, and our modeling is consistent with that, which is why the only non-aviation carbon tax revenues are ever reallocated to households. That other portion goes to government spending. So when it says 100%, it's only non-aviation portions 100%, right?
Oh, that's really interesting.
But that would be incredibly useful research, Jonathan. And also just to comment on something, Seth, in terms of like the question of, does the taxation of the aviation emissions result in greenhouse gas emissions, additional greenhouse gas emissions reduction? So that we have embedded in the model, right? Let me put my screen share back up. And the answer is it does, right? It does matter, even though we have inelastic demand, particularly really inelastic visitor demand represented in the model. So here we go. So it is a meaningful difference, right? A couple percentage points when you don't tax aviation. The reason it's not more meaningful is because we have inelastic demand for jet fuel. Which matters when we start thinking about the welfare impacts too, because we have this sort of large kind of export good, if you will, that's actually paying into the carbon tax revenue. Okay, are there other questions, or I'm going to jump right into kind of these administrative considerations that we've been digging into? All right, I'll keep going.
I do
So
have one
something
more.
we've been giving
McKenna?
a lot of.
McKenna, I just do have one more question, just
ahead, Seth.
because I think it'd be really relevant to the legislation proposed. According to your model, it's irrelevant if, let's say the airlines bought a carbon offset, right? In order, because it would be irrelevant to your model if they bought carbon offsets, or does the actual reduction have to go away? You know, I'm just trying to think, like, if the legislatures wanted to think like, okay, it's okay if you buy carbon offsets for building all the airlines, like plant trees somewhere, how does that affect your model at all?
Well, in terms of what we model, it doesn't. So the model does not have carbon offsets into it, right? So what we've modeled is a direct carbon tax on greenhouse gas emissions without offsetting. So something that we haven't dug into yet, but actually I think could add a section, and this is a good prompt to do so, is you could add offsets into either a carbon tax function or what more naturally happens within a cap and trade program that I'll talk about in a second, because it's already built in, right? So that is very possible. There's ways to address it in either scheme, although kind of more typically within cap and trade systems. Yeah, here, that's a good point. Let me start on this, and then I'll comment on the offsets as we go. So we've been digging into, you know, the model we looked at was a carbon tax in terms of the carbon price, right? But really there are two ways to levy a carbon price within any economy, including Hawaii's, and that's either through a tax a direct tax or through a cap and trade system. So we've talked a lot about the kind of issues with a carbon tax. And I think it's a common and strong recommendation that carbon taxation should be done upstream, right? At the highest point upstream as possible so that you capture the point of entry. And for Hawaii, this is actually very simple, right? Compared to other locations, this is a relatively simple proposition because, we don't have any natural sources of fossil fuels inside Hawaii. This is, dealing with imports. In terms of scope, what we used in the model also tends to be the best practices and considerations around scope, right? That you're going to target the large sources of fossil fuels with your upstream carbon tax. For Hawaii, once you exclude military emissions, it's about 80%. And then also excluding the smaller percentages of non-fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions. So you're getting about 80% coverage by targeting these large fossil fuel emitters. You can extend a carbon tax to those smaller sources, right? You could extend a carbon tax to methane from landfills, for example. These are all possible. Definitely, have in our prior literature review sort of the administrative reasons why they're typically not levied on those. They're, harder to administer, harder to monitor, and we'll expand that conversation for this report. So that's kind of the consideration there. There is a question around, there's a huge question around what price, right? And I want to dwell on that for a moment. So we assume, and it's limitless in terms of what price you could assume in a model, right? And we started with the federal social cost of carbon because it is probably, it's a price we can pin to as a credible estimate of the global damages of greenhouse gas emissions. There are criticisms of the federal social cost of carbon and also commitments from the Biden administration to update the social cost of carbon estimates with greater incorporation of climate damages as well as greater incorporation of uncertainty. And both of those things are expected to increase the federal estimate. So, with those caveats, it's a decent price starting point, which is why we took that. There are other ways to set a price, right? You could think about price setting of a carbon tax based on regional harmonization, right? I don't actually, my own personal opinion on this is that it's probably not as critically important for Hawaii to do this because we have no leakage of our electric sector. This isn't as big of a deal. But you could imagine setting your carbon price to harmonize with California's carbon price, for example, if you thought that regional harmonization was important. As I said, my 2 cents is that it's not as big of a deal because we don't have a connected electric system. But that is one consideration. So the other thing you could do is actually just join up with California, right? Carbon pricing system, and that would by definition link your carbon prices. And in the cap and trade program, your carbon price would float via the auction as well as via the permit trading after the auction. So let me just spend a little time on this in terms of administrative consideration, because it is a viable option for Hawaii to consider this, right? So the Western Climate Initiative was created along with the creation of California's cap and trade market. And it was kind of this idea of how does California's market serve a broader purpose, a broader regional purpose, a way to expand carbon pricing beyond California's borders. Currently, the Western Climate Initiative includes California and Quebec as a linked market, and I'll explain that in a second, and then Nova Scotia as a standalone market. So the idea of a linked market is that you actually treat your markets as the same. You have the same auctions, you set allowances together, you have to harmonize things like your minimum price, kind of your price floor for the auction price. And those permits are entirely, the same. It doesn't matter if they're California's permits or Quebec's allowance permits, they're totally fungible. The alternative is doing something like Nova Scotia is doing, and that is using the Western Climate Initiative platform, right, which functionally is a auction platform for emission allowances all online. It's a escrow account, right? They contract with Deutsche Bank to hold the funds so that you can put the funds in advance, and then they distribute the funds to the players afterwards by sending revenues back to the participating jurisdictions, as well as the Western Climate Edition monitors emissions trading afterwards, right? So kind of a market monitoring function as well. But Nova Scotia is doing this on their own, so their permits are not tradable with California and Quebec's. As kind of a recommendation there is that we probably don't have a large enough market to do what Nova Scotia is doing. It would probably make a lot more sense from just a pure market size perspective, as well as maybe to some extent a kind of regional perspective, to join actually in California and Quebec's market with a linked. There start to have to consider, what point of regulation you're going to issue allowances or have, have compliance targets for, right? It might not be as upstream as you would recommend for a carbon tax. You might start considering more downstream entities to participate, and this would just be sort of a market size issue. That said, it might not be that big a deal if we're joining a linked market because the market is already big, right? And from that perspective, we would almost certainly be a price taker. Like, we're not going to influence the auction, the prices going at auction, except to the extent that sort of everyone in the market's participating, and that's how the price is set. There are some benefits. If we are going to do this sort of cap and trade idea, there are some benefits, of course, of joining the WCI, because a lot of the regulatory or a lot of the administrative burden of actually dealing with the auction is dealt with via WCI. That said, there's still a really substantial regulatory burden for Hawaii lead agencies, right? There are a lot of authorities that WCI needs the participating jurisdictions to have in order to see it through. So, for example, if there's discrepancies in the accounting of emissions, the participating jurisdiction needs to follow up with that and have the authority to follow up with that. It's not WCI that's going to do that. They are providing the platform, not necessarily sort of with authority to police the platform, if that makes sense. Let's see, we've already talked about this last bit, so I'm going to let that go. Are there any questions on kind of carbon taxation versus cap and trade and what some of those things might mean for Hawaii?
McKenna, at a high level, would you say it's accurate to say that while Hawaii could enter WCI cap and trade kind of system, that overall it's administratively more or less complex than a carbon tax? Feels like you're saying more.
It is more complex, for sure. So WCI brings down the complexity dramatically in important ways, but a cap and trade system is far more administratively burdensome under almost any circumstance than a carbon tax.
Thank you.
Okay. So just moving on to our kind of last section, and I'll just talk about this briefly. So kind of drawing, this is really about how should we use the revenues and how should we distribute these revenues? And there are really two conceptual arguments here, kind of theoretical arguments about the use of this kinds of revenues. The first stems from a kind of commons perspective, that the atmosphere is part of the commons, and therefore any taxation of the commons should be commonly shared, right? And this is the kind of theoretical argument that gives credibility kind of on the exact flip side to things like the Alaska Permanent Fund, right? This is the kind of conceptual argument that that kind of fund is developed on, right? So totally in the opposite objective of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but same kind of concept administratively, is that you have a common resource from which you're all benefiting. And so in the Alaska Permanent Fund case, right, it's actually put into a pool where you would make investments with it and then pay out dividends from the investments. There is criticism of the idea of doing something like that with carbon taxation, only because it sets up this kind of concept of perpetuity, right? When the aim is actually to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I do think that there's this broader commons argument is certainly in the narrative of how we think about carbon tax revenues. And also they aren't mutually exclusive, but the second is really that, a carbon tax is another tool, a tool designed for environmental purposes in this case. But it's really another form of tax revenue and taxation intervention that needs to be placed in the broader context of public finance, where you're thinking about the provision of public goods and services, efficiency and equity, right? So as I said, these aren't mutually exclusive, but I do think these are the two conceptual narratives that affect the way people think about the use of funds and the way that you might reflect on those scenarios, right? Like Marie, you said you were interested in that 80-20 split, right? And that really falls under this conceptual argument number 2, right? That there, consideration for broader public finance and public goods. So focusing on how to distribute revenues to households, what we modeled are equal payments per household income quintiles. And this is, of course, because we don't have data on every single household to be operationalized in a general equilibrium model. So we have to make aggregations and averages and use it in that way to help us inform what some of these general effects are. But when you actually get down to the administrative nitty-gritty, you can make a lot more sort of nuanced, are these equal or unequal amounts? There are strong recommendations in the literature to have equal amounts for adults and half payments for children, for example, half payments for dependents. A lot of this is a bit ad hoc, right? But it helps to think about the administrative nitty-gritty. And so we'll be documenting some of those recommendations. There's also, we had to cut it off in the modeling at a quintile, right? Of course, in the real world, you could have a gradation of that, right? And actually the CARES Act, what we recently experienced in terms of CARES Act payments, I think, give us a very, very recent insight into how that could be done, right? It wouldn't be like you're this exact cutoff line in or out. It would be some kind of scaling down. Another consideration is residents versus non-residents. This is actually fairly, the recommendation here is fairly simple, because using the existing state tax system is absolutely the most sort of administratively least burdensome way to handle redistribution. So to the extent that you can use that, that's the best. You wouldn't want to do it in the form of a tax credit, because you would lose a lot of people who didn't have tax liability, and you want to make sure that these payments are actually sort of made more progressively. You could use a tax rebate system, which is a lot better on that front. But then you run into considerations for non-filers. We have been pulling, actually, I'd like to ask some of these questions to DOE Tax, but maybe not now, but just we pulled some of the DOE Tax reports from prior filing years, and we're doing some calculations for household numbers relative to filers. And I want to check my numbers before us, but it seemed like a relatively large proportion. And it surprised us how many non-filers there are, and you guys probably have that exact data, which would be helpful. So in the case of non-filers, we've been considering how do you reach people who aren't in the tax system for whatever reason. And actually the recent outreach efforts by the federal government through the CARES Act, as well as the child tax payments, are pretty interesting, right? There have been radio ads. If you did not receive these payments because you're not in our system, please contact us. They're, easy website to go to and to send in your information in order to receive the payments. So those are the kinds of things that I think are important to think about. How do we reach those who might not be sort of in the tax system for a variety of reasons. Knowing that you're probably not going to reach everybody, but you do want to make sure you have outreach to get to the most vulnerable.
McKenna, on the household issue, and if you touched on this, I may have missed it, but I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but married filing jointly versus married filing singly, individually, is filed jointly one household and filing separately two households then? Or I mean, is there a way people can game this to get sort of two payments instead of one?
No, because it really would be done via household size, right? Is the kind of administrative recommendation, and most of the kind of the few studies, there are quite a few federal studies that say, how would we actually operationalize a carbon tax and dividend at the federal level? So drawing on those, it really is based on household size. So it wouldn't matter if you're filing jointly or individually.
Okay. And those administrative details, are they going to be in this updated study, or is that something you reference?
Yes, we'll bring in reference to some of these federal studies that have made recommendations on this front. And I mean, here I'll just say there are very few, there aren't that many, right? Sort of studies that have detailed administrative considerations. We're drawing on, there's a Treasury report that does this. There are some independent think tank organizations like RFF that have done this. A couple reports out of Columbia's Energy Institute there that have looked into this. So we're drawing on the variety of reports we can, but it's not as sort of clearly documented as, comparing our results to other peer-reviewed studies of economic impacts, for example, right? It's a little bit harder.
Yeah. Then on the lowest quintile issue, one of the things we talked about before, I don't know if you were able to include this in your study or if it comes in a later slide, but the issue of the lowest quintile, so the poor, benefit the most in terms of additional buying power from this tax, which is great. That's why it's progressive. But we haven't yet talked about how do they fund that, meaning if they're living paycheck to paycheck, but the tax goes out up front and they get it paid back at the end of the year, they may not be able to wait till the end of the year. So have you kind of gone through those types of issues at all, or is that too in the weeds?
No, I don't think that's too in the weeds. At the same time as so I think our thinking there is actually the child payments are probably pretty helpful. And the question is, where do you sort of demarcate, folks who fall into, traditional tax system that receive the payment as a rebate at the end of the year when it reconciles, versus, maybe applying to receive them quarterly, for example, right? And I think, that can be done at administrative cost, of course, right? And what we're emphasizing in this report is that there is this trade-off between sort of streamlining it within the existing tax system and making sure you reach those who really need it, and setting up some programs to reach those who really need it, either because they need the payment more frequently, and or because they fall into the category of non-filers and would not otherwise receive it, but it's very important, then having this additional system. And as I said, I think the recent experience with having, have you not received your check? Please go to this website, and actually having radio ads is kind of interesting case to draw on.
Because another way to minimize impact on the lowest household income households would be to pay out the dividends before you receive the tax revenue, based on estimates of greenhouse gas emissions, etc.
In terms of dollars and cents, do you have an estimate on how much it would produce, and then how much on average per household?
Yes, we do. It's,
So in
was
terms
in
of,
our, whoops.
so in terms of government revenue, I just happen to have that spreadsheet, luckily, right in front of me. In terms of the government revenue, it would be about 580 million in 2025, and then 612 in 2045. Under those scenarios where the government receives all, we don't have this for all the scenarios yet. And then for household revenue, it would be about $977 a year per household in 2025, and 845 per household in 2045, where they receive all the revenue.
And is that information going to be included in the report?
So we have that in the prior report.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
And we will and we'll update that based on the thing that will change that is if we're assuming it only goes through Q1 to Q4. So we will update that in this report.
And the 80-20 versus 50-50 split too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful to, I mean, we don't want to require the legislature to have to do any math on their own, right? So if they pick the 80-20 or the 50-50, this is the stream of expected additional state revenues. This is the stream of household payments that are expected. If we can have that kind of table in there, that'd be great.
Yep, can do. Absolutely.
So Dr. Kaufman, does that complete your presentation?
Yes, sorry, that is the end of my presentation. I know we're at the hour and this was the time you had allotted, Beth, but yes, thank you. But I'm happy to take other questions.
Thank you. I know that we interrupted with a lot of questions. And does anybody else have any more?
Just one last one for me, which is when would we be able to get the full write-up of this additional piece of the study with the tables and the numbers and all that?
We are writing furiously, and I think in our scope of work we had said we'd get it to you by the end of this month. I can go back and look, Murray, but that's my recollection.
As much information as you can get to us sooner would be helpful, of course, because we're starting to put together our final report. And this is obviously an important part of it. And the whole thing needs to be done in December, so.
Okay. We will write even more furiously.
Thank you. Well, and even if it needs some editing, to have the principal parts of it to discuss and make decisions on, that would be useful.
Okay, that's good to know. So we can send over a draft version that maybe might need some polishing, but at least would give you guys a starting point sooner than later.
That will be great. Thank you. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you very much for your work and for all of you being present here today from Dr. Kaufman's team. Yeah, we'll go on with the next item on our agenda. We'll look forward to hearing seeing the report when it's in its next stage. So the next item on our agenda.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We need to figure out the meeting schedule for the rest of the year. I believe that we had talked about our next meeting being scheduled on November 17th. Apparently that did not get communicated to everybody because at least one person said they're not available. Is that on everybody else's calendar?
It's on mine.
Okay, well, I think we will then meet at noon on November 17th. And then for December,
We're
as
not getting
early,
together, we're not getting together on Thanksgiving and talk about taxes while eating turkey.
well, I think we should, but we usually meet on Wednesday, so we'd have to move it to a Thursday meeting. So I don't think we want to do that. However, how about December 1st? Everybody good with that? And then should we plan to meet the following week as well, the 8th? We can always cancel a meeting, but it's hard to put one on.
Yeah, I think we ought to book as much as we can because we have a lot of work left to do.
I'm
Okay,
available on both dates. Yep.
I can do the 1st, but I can't do the 8th.
Yeah, I can't do the 8th either, but please go ahead.
how about the 15th? I see that I've got a hold on that at noon for the TRC.
Yeah, I
Actually,
have that on my calendar.
Yeah, I got it
do.
booked.
Okay, so let's go for December 1st. And then the 15th. Okay. Any other discussion about our next meetings?
Like Jonathan has a question.
Yes.
Sure. I just wanted to follow up on the fuel tax thing from before. I couldn't stand it, so I had to look at it. And the barrel tax is on petroleum products, and that is refined stuff, and it doesn't include aviation fuel. I didn't realize that, but that's right there in there. So that one was super simple.
Sorry,
The rest-
it does or doesn't?
It doesn't include aviation fuel.
So it's not-
Specifically takes it out of the
It's
barrel
not
tax.
levied on crude that is later refined into transportation fuel?
It's labeled on petroleum, or sorry, it's levied on petroleum products. And that is, so I'm talking about the barrel tax, which is a subset of the overall fuel tax. So there is a fuel tax, as McKenna mentioned, of 1 cent per gallon or something like that on aviation fuel. And that's the tax that Seth was talking about as allocated to the airport. It basically becomes an airport levy or an airport revenue. So I think that's what we're up against. So right now there's that general tax. Then there's what's called the barrel tax, which specifically excludes aviation fuel. And I think the reason for that is, like I said earlier, they play around with the allocation of that all the time. So they want to make sure that's not limited there. So I was wrong about that. So I think that, and I did some other, I just poked around on the internet a little bit, and it seems like for aviation fuel, Hawaii mostly imports refined aviation fuel. So I think trying to apply it to crude oil that then gets turned into aviation fuel. I don't know if it would probably be allowed, but it wouldn't be effective for aviation fuel.
Yeah, that was the principal thing. If we're refining crude, I think we can get it with the barrel tax, but if we're importing
Sure.
refined, we probably can't. Yeah,
Right.
okay, that makes sense.
So I think that that initial research led to the question of, can we just impose this carbon tax as a tax on the crude oil? But then the next, that next answer was kind of no, because we import the aviation fuel as a refined fuel. So does that answer the question that I kind of volunteered for earlier, or do you want something more or something like that? I wasn't expecting it to be so straightforward and easy, but it kind of was. As far as designing the tax, or to try to capture aviation fuel, or do we want to leave it, or do you want to kind of leave it up, like with the allocations that McKenna seemed to do were kind of hedging toward the aviation fuel, anything imposed on aviation fuel going to the state anyway, so that could be allocated to the airport or something that would check the box. So I guess my question is, do you want anything more on the fuel tax limits?
I'll give an initial answer from my perspective, since I was the loudmouth on this, but if Beth or anyone else disagrees, obviously feel free to jump in. my basic presumption was that most of the aviation fuel was refined locally, and therefore the barrel tax would work. If it's true that it's mostly refined product, then I think we're pretty clear from what you just said that the carbon tax could not be levied. Well, if it was effective on the airline portion, it would have to stay within the airport. And I think that's what McKenna has modeled. So I think all of that is consistent. So I guess my answer is, yeah, if it's refined product that we're importing and not refining crude, then I think we're kind of done. And I think the way McKenna has represented it is probably fine. It's a little disappointing to me because I was hoping we could, get it through the barrel tax by refining crude. But if that's not the way it works, then I think you've answered the question. But if anyone else still has a nagging question with the aviation fuel, please speak up.
No, I think I agree with you. I think that's taken care of. Jonathan, I do have a question. I don't remember right off the top of my head when you were going to share with us the first draft of the report. Can you remind us?
Yes. So the initial due date was November 1st, but because I got started, I asked for November 8th. That's Monday. So you'll get a draft on Monday. So a week from 2 days ago. So about 5 days from now. And I'm glad you brought that up. I did want to take a few minutes and just kind of preview or prologue the report. It's going well, and you will get that draft on Monday. But being that there's not a lot of primary sources like the big PFM group study that was done for the previous several commissions, or even like a write-up of all the stuff that Baybars did with narrative and everything like that, like for an appendix document. There's not a lot of primary documents to rely on. So the report has gotten a lot bigger than already, without the carbon tax stuff, than the previous report. So I think there's going to be, so I just wanted to let you know that, that there is going to be some room to edit down, or if you do like that additional narrative being in the report itself, because there's not this, it seems to me like this commission's report is not going to be as heavy on appendices as the last few. I'm going to format it 14-point font and double space like the last one. I think that looks good. And given that it should be about 40 pages, the last one was about 28. So we're not talking about anything huge. And also, I mean, since there's not an abundance of other consultant reports, and this is the real reason I'm saying this, is I have kind of tried to put together a clean, like as clean as I can draft now. So I think that does a couple things. It'll kind of highlight what kind of questions haven't been answered. So to do that, I have kind of completed some of the commission's sentences and kind of, tried to fill out the recommendations, and it might go in some places when you read it a little farther than you think you went in the meetings. And so I'm just saying that now so that when you read it, you're not saying, who does this guy think he is? Because what I'm doing there is not to try to take it on myself and run with it and do my own agenda, but just to kind of get what I think looks complete. And then I think that'll highlight the holes and the unanswered questions.
No, that sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I've been working on it every day, just chipping away at it. So you will get that draft on Monday.
Okay. Looking forward to seeing that sometime next week, and we'll see you on the 17th then. So with that, it's 1:14 and the meeting is adjourned. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.